All right, so for part two here, I just really want to kind of go through how to build a lesson in case you haven't done a lot of that in the past, or maybe just to give you a refresher on what goes into lesson planning, particularly into a unit now that you're building, through that backward design model and understanding. Okay, so I've got my standards, got my essential questions, I have my learning targets, I've built my assessments. Now, how do I go about teaching those and planning those lessons? And it's important to always have objectives, right? We've talked about that. Use action words. Bloom's taxonomy is great for that. If you're someone who's familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, you've probably seen the forms or the ranging colors of words that go from simple things like summarize all the way up to analyze. You want to make sure you're doing those kind of things. All right, so when we're talking about anticipatory sets or bell ringers or hooks, sometimes they're referred to as warm-up or introduction activities. And really they're just meant to provide some sort of interest or motivational factor for students, grab their attention. Like I said before, it could be a fun fact, could be an interesting picture you put up that gets them thinking about inquiry type questions. Oftentimes it's meant to kind of set the tone and connect the learning in the lesson with what you're doing. So some examples might be a question, a story. You can read the list here, but also, like I had mentioned before, a picture, a video, just an interesting question. Or maybe if you're teaching some unit on vocabulary, you write up a really interesting word or the way a different country might spell something or a way something was spelled in the past. And that would be a way to get students actively engaged in the learning. So with standards-based grading at our district and standard reference grading, we've really made a big push towards pre-assessment and post-assessment, which is something you should be doing on a regular basis anyway. And I know that was a big step for me in the last few years in making that change from what do my students know, what do I teach them, and then what do they know at the end? Because a lot of times I was afraid to pre-assess for the fact that, well, maybe the students know everything already, and then I'm going to have to go through and change everything that I'm teaching, or the fact that maybe they don't know any of this stuff. And what if I then teach this big unit and I informally, assess them along the way, and we get to the end and they still don't know any of it? So pre-assessment has been something I've been working really hard on the last couple of years, and that's something that I would encourage most of you to continue to try to do if you're not doing it already. But it really helps you figure out these questions. So things like, what are the characteristics of the learners in your class? What do students already know? In which ways do your students learn best? And your pre-assessment doesn't always have to be paper and pencil. It should be a lot like your post-assessment. In some cases, it might be exactly that way. But in other cases, like in math, it probably wouldn't be the same problems, just the same expectations and skill set. And then it also allows you to think about what sort of modifications do you need to make. And then you come to the kind of the meat part of a lesson plan, which is the procedures and the presentation. So you want to have a pretty well laid out step-by-step plan of what you're doing. You also then want to talk about, like I mentioned before with the Upper Iowa plan, assessing prior knowledge, acquiring new knowledge, those steps to really help. And it's nice to let students know what you're doing. I typically tell them, here's what the expectations are for the class. Here's what we're going to be doing. Sometimes I'll even say, here's my week-long plan, just to give them a chance to ask questions or feel like, well, I really didn't understand this stuff before. Now we're going to move on. I need some help with that, that kind of thing. It also allows you to provide specific activities to make sure your students are learning. This is where we talk about differentiation, not only based on academic abilities, but student interest and student learning styles. And also is where you're going to be providing models of new skills. So things like examples on the board, or maybe it's you're asking students to analyze or synthesize something. So you read the first passage as a class, you do that sort of thing. You talk about it, you analyze it as a group, and then you have them work on one on their own. Maybe they're going to be writing some sort of essay or reflection, so you work through some kind of graphic organizer as a group. That's where those sort of things would fit into. You always want to make sure you have the materials. Nothing's more embarrassing as a teacher than to say, oh, I need somebody to go make me 17 copies, or, oh man, I knew we needed construction paper or scissors for that project. So make sure you have all your materials ahead of time. You can't always 100% of the time avoid those sort of situations where, man, I forgot to make copies, or something happened the previous period or during your prep and you didn't get to it. But try to have all those things you need, and you find that if you put those on your lesson plan, if someone were to walk in, or if you were to have to leave for some reason and a substitute would have to come in, they could pick up right where you're at. The other thing is make sure you have enough of it. And we've all been in that situation where we're saying, oh, well, you might have to share with the person next to you because I didn't realize there were this many of you in there. Or you didn't realize the previous class had walked out with half of your scissors or pens or whatever. So make sure you have the stuff you need. And then the biggest thing is practice. And at our school, we made a big shift from the word homework to the word practice. And the reason for that is we felt that with standards reference grading and standards based grading, practice reflected more of the attitude we were looking for in our students. And so oftentimes when you talk about practice, you're talking about how are students learning those skills. And as we explain it through a sports metaphor with our students a lot of times is you can't play in the game unless you've been at practice. You can take the assessment, right, and not do very well because you didn't do the practice. Same thing goes with the sporting analogy there. We have guided practice. We have individual practice. Both of those are used to see where a student's at, maybe to see what they're thinking or how they're learning a fact. You see a lot of this in math, where you have the teacher give this sort of presentation on here's the new skill we're working on or the review skill we're working on. Now I want us to do a couple together in class, and then I want you to take a few home and do those and then bring them back and we'll talk about them tomorrow. But practice is an essential part to your lesson plan. It's important to build that time into your lesson plan so that you can actually have time to either do the practice or work through the practice when they bring it back the next day. So this is just a quick list of learning activities that you might want to think about incorporating if you're not already doing it. Things like graphic organizers, presentations, performances. You can read the list here. Some of the other things that I found that work really well in my classroom, learning activity-wise, are things like think, pair, share, read, discuss, and write. The idea of using, like it says here, graphic organizers, but using them in a multitude of ways. Flipped classrooms would also fit into learning activities, where you're having students do the knowledge acquisition outside of class, and then you have more of a facilitatory role in students learning, as well as having them do sorts of peer things. I use some things that are called RAFs, which stand for role, audience, format, and topic. I also use tic-tac-toe learning activities where students are picking, give student choice as well as preference. So there are a lot of different things you can do, and this is just a very small list of things that you can do to actually engage students in learning in those lesson plans. And then you have the kind of wrap up or the closure. So what do you want students to leave your classroom knowing? Sometimes it can be a ticket out the door card, which can also be that idea of assessment. You can also have, as it talks about here, students summarize. It can be a teacher summarize it. Sometimes I'll say things like, okay, give me the 3 most important things we talked about in class today. And 3 different students, I'll call them. Or I'll go back to the learning target and say, now, tell me what was the most important part of the pre-Revolutionary War in Boston, or something like that. And it allows students to not only internalize the information you gave them, but also share that out with a peer. Sometimes I do things like, with your elbow partner, talk about what you found to be the most influential thing that we talked about in class, or the thing you're going to remember most. And what it really does is it allows you as the teacher, or me as the teacher, to set students up and be ready for the next day. And then the last thing we want to talk about in lesson planning is the evaluation. And if we think about understanding by design, the assessment piece is actually the second part. It's not the final part. So if you're planning backwards, it's that part of how do I assess what my students know? And I don't want us to get stuck in this idea that it has to be paper and pencil. A lot of you have talked in your discussions about things like simulations, role playing, creating things like poems and artwork, all different kinds of things that allow us to assess. The biggest thing, and I've said this a couple of other times, is making sure that we match our assessment style with our instructional style. So if you're a teacher that tends to stand up in the front and give a lot of lectures and take a lot of notes, a paper pencil test probably fits you. If you're someone who's very student-led project-based learning sort of thing, a paper pencil test probably isn't the best way for you to evaluate your students. And the biggest thing is you have to be able to take these assessment data and figure out if your students are truly meeting the standards that they need to meet and where they are along that spectrum. And that creates chances, like we talked about before, for revision, reflection, both as a student and a teacher, especially if you're working in a standards-based grading or standards reference grading situation. So the assessment piece is key, and if you've gone through the UBD steps like you should, the assessment should match up perfectly with the instruction, and you should be able to guess within a small margin where your students are actually going to be at when they take those evaluations or those assessments. And if they really miss, then you have to go back and say, did I miss something when I taught it? Did I miss something when I set up my assessment? Or do I need to go back and reteach? Is it through an MTSS model? Is it through a whole group instruction? But those are some of the things that I want you to think about as you're going through and creating lesson plans. Stage 2 is due on Sunday, the 27th. And so I'll make sure you get that turned in as well. And if you have any questions about those kind of things, or if you're having some trouble creating different lessons within your unit, don't hesitate to contact me. I'd be happy to give you some feedback. Thanks, and enjoy Thanksgiving.